Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Welcome to Religion and Life. Most of us have always believed that one of the important principles on which our nation was founded was the separation of church and state. Yet religion shapes public values, behaviors, and even our laws and public policy. Our guests today are Dr. Andy Koch of the Department of Government and Justice Studies and Dr. Paul Gates of the Department of Communication. They have written the book Medieval America, a study of religion's influence on American public life, and they're here to help us understand the complex ways religion influences our society. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Let me start by congratulating you on this book. It was published in 2012, but still certainly important for our discussions today as the political season gets fully functional and we see religion inserting itself into the political process. So I think this is a timely discussion. I'm interested, first of all, just to hear how the book idea came about, how the two of you got together into this co-authoring situation, and how all that worked, how you put your thoughts together as this book evolved.
Well, I first got interested in the topic when I was living in Pakistan. I was a Fulbright scholar there in the mid-90s. And I would have discussions about religion and politics with some of the students at Quaid-e-Azam University, where I was based. And they would say to me, oh, well, you know, you're a Christian. And I would say, well, you know, I don't really practice a religion. They said, no, it doesn't matter, you're a Christian. And as I dove into this and asked them, you know, why do you come to that conclusion? They would tell me, well, it's because essentially you grew up in a Christian culture, and so the influences of Christianity are there whether you know, overtly practice the religion or not. And the more I thought about it, you know, the cultural influences, the way the ideas impact the society, the institutional structure, the laws, it began to make more and more sense to me. And so I began thinking about this, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the different facets of it, and that's how I came around to it.
So even though there's not an established religion in the United States, because the culture is predominantly Christian, there is this association of Christian values and beliefs that have influenced behaviors and certain law codes, even public policy in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we claim to be a secular society, but what secularism really means is that the laws and the things that people believe are going to be filtered through a legislative process, through a governmental process, whereby those beliefs are translated into laws. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that religion will have no influence, because it affects what people believe, and people act on their beliefs.
Yeah. Okay. And Paul, you were getting ready to insert.
I was going to say how we got together and how we came to this was, I think probably around 2009 or so, we began to notice a resurgence of religious values in public discourse. And we decided we would write a paper for a political science convention. And we wrote the paper that turned into the chapter on the flag. And then we thought, well, what do we do next? And we thought, well, if we do one of these every year, it'll be forever before we get this thing written. So we decided to get serious and sketched out an outline of the areas we wanted to cover, and then sat down and wrote it in probably about 6 or 8 months after that.
And the flag chapter's a little bit different from the rest of the book. I mean, the veneration of the American flag is not a religious veneration. It's a civil religious veneration, perhaps, but I guess you use that chapter to illustrate the way that civil values can be raised to a religious level as well. Is that correct?
We approach that looking at the elevation of the flag to the status of an icon. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of the chapter, we relate that to an incident from the 16th century where an Italian was punished, in fact hanged, for assaulting or defacing an icon. And we then go into how we have achieved the same status, nearly so, with the American flag.
Right. Okay. Let me ask you about the title of the book, Medieval America. Now, obviously, this is not a historical study of America during medieval times.
Right.
So the title itself, I think, gets to the theme and thesis of the book. Do you want to flesh that out just a little bit?
Yeah, we were looking for something that sort of captured the role that beliefs play, particularly beliefs that are unchallengeable. And so we thought that the idea of medievalism, that is the influence of a kind of theocratic institutional order, kind of captured the sense of what we wanted to convey in the book. So that was kind of the origin of the title.
Would you, and I know you do this in the book, but maybe briefly sort of contrast the medieval viewpoint as you have constructed it in your argument to, I think what you see as a better worldview, which would be the modern worldview or the secular worldview or perhaps a materialist worldview. I don't know how you would best phrase that, but what would be the essential elements of the medieval worldview that I think you're suggesting religion promotes versus a secular worldview?
Well, I think we look at the medievalism as a belief system established, going all the way back to Aquinas and so forth, but a belief system based on faith that then evolved into this association and influence on law and public policy. Mm-hmm. And what we are arguing for here is a system of laws and social construction based on reason and scientific method, and we think that's appropriate for an educated, secular, highly technological society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the recurring themes in the book, I think, is this constant tension between the religious way of viewing knowledge and knowledge construction as it impacts our social world and the scientific view. And we examine, for example, what happened as the national government started getting more involved, particularly in science education, and making the teaching of evolution, for example, standard curriculum across the country, and the backlash that occurred once the national government got involved and started creating these standards, and then suddenly these small communities where evolution was not only not taught but made illegal, and it created this backlash. And so we chronicle sort of the evolution of that dynamic and that tension.
Yeah, the insertion of science and so forth into religious belief, it's breaking into that closed epistemological loop that allowed for no other explanations, no alternative viewpoints that had been established in prior centuries and brought to early America too. And this is a phenomenon I think we see certainly since the publication of Darwin's magisterial work on the origin of species. And a lot of those arguments that we're talking about here, the local backlash, was based on that kind of thinking.
So you've got the medieval viewpoint, which views truth as fixed and static, and which includes a kind of closed way of arriving at truth.
Well, and also has its origins in the formulation of a sacred text.
Right.
I mean, regardless of the religion. And so the religious text then becomes the validating mechanism for claims to truth, as opposed to observation and experimentation.
And that would be the closed epistemological
Right.
loop. So you're
Right.
constantly referring back to the text to substantiate truths found in the text.
Which of course means it's not falsifiable in any way, and it's essentially closed off from experiential reality or material
And that's
reality.
what creates the contrast and the conflict with the scientific worldview,
Yeah,
which is
right.
empirically based, experientially based.
It also helps explain why, how can I put this? It's difficult to argue with someone who holds those kinds of closed epistemological beliefs as part of a system, because no empirical evidence can kind of break through into their argument. And so we don't see so much an evolution in thinking. What we see is a conflict between two epistemological systems.
Okay. Since you bring up the text, let me ask you a couple questions about this, because I think you have some fairly critical things to say about not the text itself, but the way people read the text and refer to the Bible. So certain religions promote a kind of literalism based on the Bible text. And I think at one point in the book, you referred to this sort of literal interpretation of the text as being the playground of children and simpletons, right? I think that's your words, or something like that. And then at another point in the text, you refer to a kind of modified literalism where readers of the text may not view it in a narrow literal fashion, but still claim the text has authority. And I think you referred to this stance as somewhat hypocritical. If 3/4 of Americans claim to believe in the authority of the text, does that mean that 75% of us are hypocritical or are simple? Is that what you're saying here, or?
Well, I think not. It's not quite that. I think what we're talking about is sort of a slavish adherence to the text, and not that, and based on habit and cultural assumptions and so forth that have been with us a long time. It's not easy to change a belief system, particularly one this fundamental,
right,
to life, to American society.
Yeah. There are different layers to this argument, as you point out,
right.
And the argument that we have to alter our understanding of science because of a text that was, fragments of something pieced together 4,000, 5,000 years ago. It just doesn't make rational sense, right, quite frankly. Now, are a lot of mainstream religions able to sort of reconcile things like evolution with biblical teachings? Well, you could say, yeah, okay, we'll read the text metaphorically.
Right.
But then, if we're reading it metaphorically, you have to ask a different question. Should we then understand the text as a definitive truth, or as a historical document to be read anthropologically, which means it's the story of a people who are attempting to civilize themselves, but in a pre-scientific culture. And I think once you read it that way, you view the text differently, and it takes away a lot of its power. And so, read anthropologically, I think there's an awful lot in there. We see, events that shaped the history of the Jewish people in the Old Testament. We see the teachings of tolerance and civilization, let's say, in the New Testament. But that doesn't make them not stories.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, so there are these layers of interpretation, I think, and perhaps, I think I heard you saying toward the end of the book that there's room maybe for certain ways of being with the text as an authoritative text alongside of a scientific worldview, that the two could perhaps coexist in some way, or is that kind of out of the question in a complete materialistic society?
Well, I think anthropologically it is possible to read it in a way that makes sense. I mean, it's an effort for this pre-literate society to explain the natural world.
Right.
And and just regarding it as evolution, for instance, as the device through which the deity operates. That's the part of that interpretation is not the crazy people, that 75%, but that's the way a lot of people do view it as a story, but one that is flawed nonetheless.
Well, let's get away from the Bible a little bit and talk about the chapter on the criminal justice system. I thought that you really made your case succinctly and clearly in that chapter. And as I understand it, essentially you're arguing that in the United States there is a high incarceration rate as compared to the rest of the civilized world. And that part of the reason for that is this model of retributive justice is in place here, and that's actually based on our kind of common cultural religious heritages. And I think that's essentially the argument. And then you outline 3 or 4 different ways of seeking or dealing with criminal population. So if you could maybe outline that argument a little bit and talk a little bit about the alternatives that could reform the criminal justice system as you outlined it in that chapter.
Well, what we talk about in that chapter is how the early Christian thinking was that an offense was an offense against God and deserved punishment. Often very, very harsh punishment, and we grew up with that tradition over a number of centuries. And of course, now we're finding that it's not as effective. It makes feel-good sense in a way, but as a method of controlling crime or even reducing crime, which of course would be the ultimate goal, it's not effective. And we do mention that at the end of that chapter, talk about how what has been found to be a better way, and this is not a new idea actually, this came from the from 18th century Italy, that the sureness of punishment and the swiftness of punishment in tandem are much more effective in reducing crime than just the idea that you need to be punished because of what you've done.
Well, we also take on the issue of this retributive idea of justice as being only one of, different models. I mean, you have a rehabilitation model of justice, you have a restorative notion of justice, and in fact, the suggestion is that this retributive model is actually leading to the heavy incarceration rates and producing the kinds of social problems that brings about. So there are, the point, I guess, is to say, well, there are other models of justice out there that might be worth exploring.
Is there an example of another model of justice, perhaps in a country somewhere that has been successful, not only in dealing with the criminal population, but also reducing the rates of incarceration?
Well, restorative justice is very popular in Africa, and it's been used, and the idea of restorative justice is that, wrongdoers have to admit their acts and hold themselves accountable for their acts, but the idea is to restore the community to balance as opposed to punishing the individual. And the perpetrator has a responsibility to participate then in restoring that balance, depending on what the
Yeah, and I think there's probably even a little bit of the idea of restorative justice in the Bible itself, and I'm wondering how the retributive model came to dominate, and some of these other methods, which may be grounded in religion, have taken a back seat in America. I don't know if you have any notions about that or not. I guess the retribution and justice model is seen as more dominant in the text. Is that
absolutely? I think that's fair to say. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Not only do you critique this medieval notion that has this, I guess, undue impact on public policy in America, but in the end of the book, you have a prescription for moving away from predominantly medieval orientation toward a more modern orientation. And one of those prescriptions I found interesting would be to do away with the practice of electing members of state boards of education, I think. And then you talk about why that makes sense even in a kind of democratic culture. Could you talk a little bit about the problem with electing state boards of education and what other model might be put into place to help overcome that?
Well, early in the book, we talk about the role of education in perpetuating biblical interpretations and the efforts to, quash discussions of the scientific method and so forth. And we don't say so in the book, but I'm just going to say I think education is probably the solution to most everything. Mm-hmm. And the funding model that we've created for public education in the United States is this very small community-based system, and we go over in the chapter on education how school boards, local school boards, have gotten themselves into this jam with secular society by insisting on inserting creationism and intelligent design and those kinds of beliefs into school classrooms and through texts, through teacher indoctrination and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it's the local level. It's kind of easy to pull that off at the local level.
Yeah, and democracy itself, I'll say something that may be politically incorrect here, but democracy doesn't guarantee that people get the best government, the best education system, the best anything. It just guarantees they get a reflection of what they think echoed back to them.
Right.
And so when you have an institution like, let's say, a state university system in which academic quality is its benchmark, you might be better to rely on the people who are trained and experts in your higher education institutions to formulate the curriculum for the students at the local level. Mm-hmm. And we have problems now continuing. Kansas, Tennessee, I can rattle off places where these school boards are not really interested in pursuing secular education, scientific education as part of the program for their students. Mm-hmm. That would be different if, let's say, the state university systems in those states controlled the educational models, the textbooks, and the methods of teaching. We would probably find ourselves not only creating a more secular society in the long run, but we'd probably find that our students were better educated and better prepared for college in the long run as well.
And Darwin tends to be the flashpoint here, right? We're 150 years on and still can't quite come to terms with Darwin's theories as the predominant scientific model. Is that what you see still going on in America's public schools across the board, or is it localized examples?
I like to tell my students that the rest of the world is moving into a postmodern paradigm, and we're still struggling with modernity. But yeah, I think that this still takes place. The battles are still going on. We talked about this earlier. Louisiana, Mississippi, the courts had to step in and force the repeal of laws forbidding the teaching of evolution.
Mm-hmm. And it's probably not.
It's recent.
It's probably worth saying too that it's not just southern states. we don't mean to single out Texas and Louisiana, and Arkansas is another one of the big ones in Tennessee. But the most recent example of a school board attempting to insert religion in the curriculum is in Dover, Pennsylvania. So it's a small town, to be sure. It was a small school district, a small rural district, but this is not confined to any one part of the country.
Right. Well, and one of your other prescriptions you might just quickly mention here is that you suggest an actual and real separation of state functions from religion. Just quickly, what do you mean by that? With an example or two.
When Congress opens its sessions with a prayer, when
there's still a chaplain attached to the Congress, right?
And so I don't think it sends the message that the notion of secularism is taken seriously, and if it's not taken seriously by those who make the laws of the land, well, then why should anybody else take it seriously?
Well, I think your work here is fascinating, and I think you have done a wonderful job in helping us to think more about the relationships between our secular society and our religious underpinnings. The title is provocative and gets right into the meat of the thesis, and I hope that people will read your book. It's available on Amazon and available in the ASU bookstore, and I imagine there are other outlets around the country. So Medieval America by Andy Koch and Paul Gates. I want to thank you for your contribution to scholarship in this area. Keep writing.
Thank you, Ozzie.
That's Religion and Life for this week. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.